In this lecture, we will consider a variety of objections to Thomas Aquinas' first three arguments for God's existence, with a special emphasis upon the third. Some of these objections are simple-minded and some are quite sophisticated. I do not include the simple-minded objections simply for the thrill of knocking down straw men, but for two reasons. First, some of these objections are extremely common, and will likely contain questions or arguments that you've heard before and will hear again. Hopefully what follows will help you find the words and ideas to provide compelling answers to such questions and arguments the next time they come up. Secondly, providing answers even to simple-minded objections, not to mention sophisticated ones, often has the advantage of helping us understand the argument better than before. How this is so should become clear as we consider the objections themselves. So let's get right to it. Objection 1. Who created God? When someone who's never heard St. Thomas's arguments for God's existence hears them for the first time, this is often the first question off of his lips. Upon hearing that God must exist in order to cause or explain the existence of the universe, they ask, but who created God? To be sure, asking this question reveals more than anything that the questioner hasn't really understood the argument in the first place. But in order to provide an answer, it's important to understand exactly what's being asked. More often than not, what the questioner really means is something like this. If everything must have a cause, what's God's cause? This would be a serious question, of course, if the argument stated that everything must have a cause. But as we've seen in the last lecture, Thomas Aquinas never says any such thing. What he says is that everything that comes into existence must have a cause, and that everything that exists contingently must have an explanation for its existence. Since God neither comes into existence nor exists contingently, he requires no such cause or explanation. As we saw in the last lecture, many will mistakenly interpret Thomas's argument to suggest that God, unlike everything else, is some kind of self-cause. But this also would be incorrect. God, according to this argument, does not somehow conjure himself up out of nothing. That would indeed be impossible. Again, the conclusion of the argument is not that God is a self-cause, but that he is an uncaused cause. He is therefore not caused to exist by himself, nor by anything else. Objection 2. Why is it necessary that the universe has a cause? Maybe it's just always been there, with no beginning. Unlike the so-called Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence, advanced by the Muslim thinker Al-Ghazali and many contemporary philosophers, Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument is entirely indifferent as to whether the universe had a temporal beginning. This is a crucial point to understand. How can St. Thomas's claim that the universe must have a first cause be squared with an openness to the possibility that that same universe is beginningless? As we saw in the previous two lectures, his argument only claims to show that there exists a cause of the universe's existence, not that the universe came into existence at some moment in the finite past. To reiterate, St. Thomas is saying that, for all human reason can discern, the universe may well be without a temporal beginning. It may, in other words, go back to infinity. But even if it does go back to infinity, this still does not remove the need for an explanation. Even an infinite series of contingent things is still itself contingent, and as contingent, it still requires an explanation as to why it exists at all. Simply suggesting that the universe had no beginning does nothing to provide that explanation. We must still, therefore, arrive at the existence of a first cause, a first mover, or a necessary being. Objection 3. If God just exists inexplicably, why can't the universe? According to this argument, the reason that God's existence has no explanation outside of itself is solely the fact that God is a necessary being. The material universe, which is nothing other than the sum total of all material things, cannot be a necessary being. To be material is to be subject to change, and likewise to be subject to existing or not existing. Whatever material thing one imagines, one can also imagine a perfectly consistent and plausible universe without that thing. Likewise, one can imagine a perfectly consistent and plausible universe with no material thing whatsoever. It is precisely for this reason that we call the universe contingent. Still, one might object, okay, but even granted that the universe is contingent, why must we hold that it must have an explanation? Perhaps the universe as a whole is an example of a contingent thing that happens not to have an explanation. The universe would simply be, on this account, an exception to the rule. This suggestion, when subjected to rational scrutiny, simply falls apart. When presented with other contingent truths, we would readily recognize the absurdity of suggesting that they simply have no explanation whatsoever. Imagine that you're walking through a forest and you come to an area where the trees are 2 and 3 times as far apart from one another as the rest of the forest. Immediately, you begin to wonder why this is so. Now imagine your surprise if your traveling companion suggests that there simply is no explanation for this whatsoever. On questioning him, you learn that he doesn't just mean that the explanation is too complicated to understand, or that the sudden change in tree distribution is caused by a kind of randomness. He quite literally means that there just is no explanation at all. You would be quite right seriously to doubt your companion's conclusion. Why? Because the distribution of trees in the forest, being what it is not a necessary truth. And so there must be some explanation as to why the trees are distributed in the way that they are. At the very least, if your traveling companion's suggestion is to be taken seriously at all, he would at least have to provide an explanation as to why there's no explanation in this case. For the same reason, atheists would similarly need to explain why the contingent universe as a whole, in contrast to all other contingent things and facts in our experience, has no explanation. They must explain, in other words, why they are exempt from explaining why something exists rather than nothing. Objection 4. Maybe the universe itself is a necessary being. Now, this objection, to my knowledge, is not made by any professional philosopher or major figures in the history of philosophy, though it is often made by non-philosophers. Why cannot the universe itself be a necessary being? Because this would mean that the material universe would be such that it could not be. But how can any material thing, or conglomeration of material things, have this property? To make this objection, one would have to take on the burden of showing that a universe containing no material thing whatsoever, say a universe with only God and his angels, would be impossible. In fact, if the actual universe is a necessary one would have to take on the burden of showing that a material universe containing different material parts would be impossible. I have no idea how one would even begin to go about proving that, or even showing that it's likely. Maybe this has something to do with the fact that atheist philosophers avoid this line of argument altogether. Objection 5. The material universe does have an explanation, but that explanation is just some prior physical state of affairs. That is, just more nature. Remember that by material universe, the argument we're considering means the totality of all matter and energy. This would include any other big bangs that may have taken place or other universes that might be out there somewhere, however different their physical constitution may be. If, therefore, the explanation of our universe is some external physical state of affairs, this state of affairs would simply be part of what we mean by material universe. It would not then be an explanation, but part of that which needs to be explained. Objection 6. The notion of a necessary being is self-contradictory, like a square circle. Only propositions can be necessary, not beings. What is a contradiction in terms? It's one in which the adjective is logically inconsistent with the noun it modifies. Contradictions in terms, therefore, are notions like married bachelor, square circle, or a part that is greater than the whole. If we understand rightly the concepts of married, square, part, bachelor, circle, and whole, we see immediately why these are indeed contradictions, and therefore not descriptions of things that could exist in reality. But why, we must ask, is the notion of a necessary being a contradiction in terms? What is it about a being, a thing that exists, that excludes the notion of necessity? Granted, the beings that we're used to encountering on a daily basis are contingent, that is, not necessary. But this does nothing to show that a being could not be necessary. Such reasoning would be like assuming that because every human I've ever seen is white, it follows that humans can only be white, or that whiteness somehow belongs to the essence of humanity, as four-sidedness belongs to the essence of squareness. This objection states that only propositions can be necessary, not beings. But this is just nothing more than an assertion. If it helps, we may state clearly and concisely what a necessary being would be in terms that this objector might understand better. Being X is a necessary being if and only if the statement, X exists, is a necessarily true proposition. We may defy anyone to point out where the contradiction is in that. Objection 7. Okay, someone might say, I see that a necessary being isn't a contradiction in terms, but I just can't imagine what a necessary being would be like. Neither can I. But why is this really a problem? The question should not be whether one can imagine a necessary being, but whether the concept of a necessary being is a coherent one and free from internal contradiction. Consider, for instance, an example from René Descartes' well-known Meditations on First Philosophy. Very few people know what a chiliagon is. As we saw, a chiliagon is a 1,000-sided polygon. But who can imagine a 1,000-sided polygon, with each of its 1,000 sides as clearly part of our image as when we imagine a square or a triangle? The answer, I suspect, is that no one, or at least very few people, could. And yet, once it's explained, everyone can formulate the concept of a chiliagon, so defined. The concept of a 1,000-sided polygon is actually quite simple. Why the difference? According to Descartes, this is easily explained by noticing the difference between one's imagination, which formulates images directly from our five senses, and one's intellect, which formulates abstract concepts or ideas. It should come as no surprise that a necessary being is not something of which we can have an image. And this is precisely because, as we've seen, a necessary being cannot be a material or physical thing. To imagine it would be like imagining the number 4, which is not just extremely difficult, as in the case of a chiliagon, but inherently impossible. The concept of a necessary being, on the other hand, while not as simplistic as the concept of some geometrical shape, is something that the human intellect can comprehend quite clearly, and which, as we've shown, contains no inherent contradiction. Objection 8. Okay, there exists a necessary being, but why call this being God? The argument for the existence of God, explained in the last few lectures, requires a being that is not only necessary, but also immaterial, not composed of physical or material parts, eternal, outside of time and space, and in some sense creative, because it is the cause or explanation of everything else in existence. Granted, this is not a comprehensive account of the biblical God, but it nevertheless bears a striking resemblance. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is also, by most accounts, a spiritual, that is to say, an immaterial being. He's also a creator, according to Genesis chapter 1. When the psalmist says that, "Thou, O Lord, endurest forever," it's not a far stretch to see this as implying eternality. And finally, when God reveals himself to Moses as, "I am who am," it's often said that this implies something at least very close to the claim that God is a necessary being. I am, in other words, a being whose very nature it is to be. Again, this is not a complete description of God in the biblical sense, but it should at least be obvious that the existence of such a being is enough to refute the claims of atheism. Unfortunately, many atheists fail to appreciate this point. As Richard Dawkins says in criticizing what he takes to be something like St. Thomas's argument for God's existence, quote, "Even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name, simply because we need one, there's absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God. Omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, and to say nothing of human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts." End of quote. Dawkins' argument is entirely beside the point. As we've seen, St. Thomas's argument succeeds in demonstrating the existence of an immaterial, eternal, creative, and metaphysically necessary being. It is indeed a strange criticism of that argument simply to point out that it doesn't also prove that that being does not, among other things, listen to our prayers, forgive our sins, and read our thoughts. The argument does not aspire to show these things, nor does it reveal what killed off the dinosaurs. Objection 9. Doesn't St. Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument commit the fallacy of composition by assuming that, because everything in the universe has an explanation, the universe as a whole must have an explanation? The fallacy of composition is committed when someone assumes without justification that the whole is a certain way because all the parts are that way. An example of this fallacy might be if one assumes that an orchestra will be excellent, simply because all the musicians in that orchestra are excellent. Or if one assumes that a stew will be tasty, simply because all of the ingredients are tasty. To use an example made by the atheist Bertrand Russell in his debate with Father Frederick Copleston, quote, "Every man who exists has a mother. And it seems to me your argument is therefore that the human race must have a mother. But obviously the human race has not a mother. That's a different logical sphere." End of quote. In similar fashion, critics of St. Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument and other cosmological arguments say that the universe as a whole need not have an explanation or cause, simply because each thing in the universe has an explanation or cause. As a result, any appeal to a necessary being as the cause of the whole universe is unnecessary and unwarranted. But does St. Thomas's argument commit the fallacy of composition? If it does, it cannot be simply because it reasons from parts to the whole. Recall that committing the fallacy of composition is to reason from parts to the whole without justification. This means that it's not always unjustified to conclude the whole is a certain way simply because the parts are that way. Consider a blank sheet of white paper. It would be invalid to conclude that, because each square inch of the paper is square, the paper as a whole must be square. But it would not be invalid to conclude that, because every square inch of the paper is white, the whole piece of paper must be white. Nor would it be wrong to conclude that the content of a water jug is entirely liquid, because every pint of that jug is liquid. Whether reasoning from part to whole is valid or not, it seems, just depends on the kind of thing and the properties of that thing that is under discussion. It may not be fallacious at all, therefore, to conclude that the whole universe is contingent and has an external explanation, because every material thing in the universe is contingent and has an explanation. If experience testifies that having an explanation belongs to the very nature of contingency, and if the universe is not itself a necessary being, it simply follows that the universe as a whole is contingent and requires an explanation. Objection 10. It's unjustified to appeal to a necessary being as the explanation of the universe because we have no experience of such a thing. Let's say that while you're sleeping, you hear a rustling noise in the attic. You immediately set to thinking about what may be causing it. Your first suspicion is some kind of critter, perhaps a mouse, a chipmunk, or a squirrel. But what if someone suggested to you that the noise was being made by a little family of gnomes or elves? To be sure, you would dismiss that explanation out of hand. But why? The answer seems to be that you have prior experience of mice, chipmunks, and squirrels. Maybe you've even seen them around your yard and in the trees close to your house. On the other hand, you've never had prior experience of gnomes or elves, and for that very fact, it seems unreasonable to appeal to them in order to explain anything, regardless of the fact that if there were gnomes or elves in the attic, they would be capable of making a rustling noise just like the one you hear. Even if the noise you hear is more like the one a gnome or elf might make, whatever that would mean, compared to that of a chipmunk, the chipmunk is still the better explanation because of the prior experience issue. This is essentially the point being made by this objection. We have no prior experience of a necessary being. Appeals to divine revelation aside, no one's ever seen or heard one, and so suggesting that a necessary being is the cause of the universe is no less absurd than suggesting that a family of gnomes or elves is causing the noise in the attic. The reasonableness of an explanation appears directly related to at least two things. First, the degree to which the explanation truly explains the phenomenon in question, in the example just given, the rustling noise in the attic, and two, the plausibility of the explanation in and of itself, based among other things on one's degree of prior experience. But how serious a criticism is this of the Thomistic cosmological argument, especially the third way of Thomas Aquinas outlined in the previous lecture? For the sake of argument, we may grant that we lack any direct prior experience of a necessary being. But in the case of St. Thomas's argument, there is one extremely important difference. A necessary being is the only possible explanation for the existence of the contingent universe. What are the alternatives? As we've seen, one could make the even more implausible suggestion that the universe itself is a necessary being. More than implausible, this claim is manifestly false. Alternatively, one might simply say that the universe's existence has no explanation. To see the persuasiveness of the argument, therefore, one need only see that a necessary being is more plausible than no explanation at all. This is, of course, why the noise in the attic analogy is a bad one. The noise is much more plausibly explained by some small woodland creature than by a gnome. But if we could somehow imagine a noise in the attic that could only have been caused by a gnome or an elf, if there even could be such a thing, the gnome or elf explanation would cease to be implausible. In fact, it would be vastly preferable to suggesting that the mysterious noise just has no explanation whatsoever. Appealing to a necessary being, therefore, even granting that we have no prior experience of such a thing, is therefore not unjustified. Objection 11. It's impossible that God created all time, space, matter, and energy at some point in the past, because that implies the contradictory notion of a time before time. Again, we must reiterate that Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument for God's existence, especially argument 3, does not suggest that God created the material universe at some moment in the finite past. And so this objection is just misplaced. Nevertheless, St. Thomas, like most Christians, Muslims, and Jews, believe that the universe was created out of nothing at a certain moment in the past. He believes it on faith. And so this objection is worth answering. In his famous autobiography, The Confessions, St. Augustine reports that, when asked what God was doing before he made heaven and earth, an annoyed respondent quipped, "Preparing hell for those who pry into such mysteries." Augustine finds this humorous because the question itself is corrupt. It makes no sense to speak of a time before creation. Even on the assumption that God created the universe at some point in the past, however, one need not suggest any such thing. Time and space, according to the consensus of modern science as well as philosophy, do not exist without matter. This means that the first moment of time was also the first moment of material existence. There was, therefore, nothing before the material universe at all. Does this mean that God came into being the same moment the material universe did? Absolutely not. God, understood as a necessary being, is eternal. This does not mean that he exists for an infinite duration of time, but that he exists outside of time. The reason that God did not exist at any time before creation is not because he's limited to time and space, but simply because there was no such time. This is the upshot of Augustine's own solution. As he explains, quote, "But if the roving thought of anyone should wander through the images of bygone time, and wonder that you, the God Almighty, and all creating and all sustaining, the architect of heaven and earth, for innumerable ages, refrained from so great a work before you would make it, let him awake and consider that he wonders at false things. For whence could innumerable ages pass, by which you did not make, since you are the author and creator of all ages? Or what times should those be which were not made by you? Or how should they pass by if they had not been? Since, therefore, you are the creator of all times, if any time was before you made heaven and earth, why is it said that you refrained from working? For that very time you made, nor could times pass by before you made times. But if before heaven and earth there was no time, why is it asked, what were you doing then? For there was no then when time was not." End of quote. We could go on to discuss scores of other objections to Aquinas' arguments. I've selected these because they tend to be among the most common. What is amazing is the degree to which the arguments we've seen so far stand up to philosophical scrutiny even now, more than 750 years later, which is yet another testimony to the fact that Thomistic philosophy remains a powerful and compelling worldview, not just for Christians, but for all clear-thinking seekers of truth.